my name is Joanna Moody. Welcome to the video on how to create a work of art around the theme Through My Window. This theme feels particularly poignant to me right now, but it's not a new theme in art. I'm sure we've all caught ourselves in the last year staring out a window, wondering how to interact with the outside world. Throughout the history of art, though, many artists have used this theme to communicate their ideas, and there are many, many ways to interpret a window's meaning in art. It could be a transparent divider separating the viewer from the viewed. It could be an invitation to an opportunity, opening to move through. It could be an illuminator. It could even be an obscurer, so suggesting that your perspective is very subjective, not objective. I've always been interested in artwork involving windows, and I'm especially drawn to portraiture that has windows in it. Now, there's a lot of art that can suggest portraiture, even if there's not a human figure in it. But there's the narrative quality that comes with this theme, the story that's being told. There's the symbolic implications that I just mentioned, just unlimited metaphors. There's the beautiful quality of natural light, and particularly when painting from life, you get all of these varied qualities that window light brings in. There's also the architectural allure and the structural abstraction of putting a frame within a frame. I just love it. I think this theme is the perfect continuation of the portraiture theme as kind of a window into our personal perspective. So in this video, we'll look at some artists that have used this theme successfully, and I'll pick out a few that stand out to me, but you could certainly go down the rabbit hole of the history of windows in art. And finally, we'll go through some tips and tricks to get you thinking about your own subject and how to approach it and challenge it to create a finished work around this theme. So enjoy. Go. From the Renaissance to present day, artists have been using windows in their artwork. It was during the Renaissance that new developments started happening with glass-blowing techniques, which created larger, clearer windows. That made for larger, more transparent windows in the architecture, but it also is kind of a metaphor for the time, this newly illuminated approach to life. It was a time of study, beauty, and perfection, and it was in direct response to the medieval age that came before it. So artists and scholars started focusing on human achievement instead of making everything about a divine plan for salvation, and it grew new significance for the role of the individual. You start to see a lot of prominent figures in society commissioning portraiture, and this painting by Albrecht Durer is a beautiful example of one of these, where the window plays a part in the background. So in 1435, there was a treatise written on how to create art. So scientific discovery was in every field, and art was no exception. This was by Leon Battista Alberti, called On Painting. And it outlined for artists how to create the perfect illusion of an outside reality in painting. So he set up a system to where the picture surface were as if it were a pane of glass. And this was revolutionary. He explained the devices of light, shadow, as well as the mathematics of linear perspective. And Durer was a master at all of these things. In this painting, the window gives the artist the ability to portray his mastery of perspective. It creates a new sense of space on the canvas, It unites man and nature and creates the harmony of the applied laws of nature and science. It is a pristine example of what the window could be, but also what was important at the time it was painted. This next image is by a famous Romantic painter, Caspar David Friedrich. You'll see similarities in this image to the one before. The subjects, both women, window in the background, definite mastery of skill in explaining detail, as well as the illusion of space. But in this painting, the illusion of space is not what is important. The Romantics believed in the importance of the imagination. They turned away from logical thinking that was so important during the Renaissance period. And this window provides the viewer the ability to have an experience that's very different. You get invited into the interior experience of the subject. A key subject for Romantic painters, something that they enjoyed as their subject, was someone peering out into the distance, sort of ruminating over what could be. And oftentimes these subjects were women, and they were placed in interiors sort of as captives of the hearth, and the painter was the liberator. This painting, the woman is seen from the back. It sort of classically represents romantic yearning. And the painting, as well as the window, are sort of intermediaries between the inner and the outer world. A critic once noted about this painting, the window is the harbor from which ships sail away into unknown expanses, into the open sea of passion towards unpredictable encounters and experiences. So, quite dramatic. And I had to follow up that painting with an Edward Hopper. Edward Hopper was born in New York in mid-20th century. And he pretty much made solitude his life's work. A lot of his paintings show a figure by a window. Large windows were introduced into the architecture at the time, and the window began to function not only as an architectural decoration, but also as this sort of symbolic separator between worlds and people. On the one hand, it seems like we can see everything that's happening, but in Hopper's paintings, we notice just this separation from the outside world by this large transparent wall. And anybody who looks at this painting is probably going to experience just the aching feeling of loneliness in a big city. Next, I chose Matisse. And this painting was done during his Fauvist period, and it is a direct rebellion of all things Renaissance. It uses no local color. He basically takes this cherished creation of illusion and smashes it in bright color and expressive brushstroke. In this way, he probably had more in common with the Romantic period because he places feeling at the front of his style, and he combines the landscape and the interior, ignoring perspective and any of its laws. Matisse describes this by saying, "The atmosphere of the landscape and my room are one and the same. The boat which is going past exists in the same space as the familiar objects around me, and the wall with the window do not create two different worlds." So Matisse has basically brought this beautiful Mediterranean day to us with no illusion of separation. We're in his space, and yet we're experiencing the atmosphere outside, uniting personal and surrounding space. So saying it's enough to open a window and you're no longer boxed in in a life inside walls. Here we have a modern painter, a modern oil painter, Carol Robbie. And Robbie does a lot of paintings. They don't have figures in them, a lot of interiors, and light is a huge focus of her paintings. She takes her immediate surroundings, uses her direct observation, and paints what she sees. And they're almost portraits of a space that obviously someone is experiencing that space. So it's as if there's a portrait of a person, but the person just left the room. She's interested in the way light reveals and conceals forms and how it influences color. And she describes just loving the process of the human eye perceiving and the heart and hand putting it down onto the canvas, sort of making the image take on a different form that has nothing really to do with the objects observed. I cannot talk about window paintings without talking about Andrew Wyeth. Andrew Wyeth did probably at least over 300 paintings just on windows themselves in different mediums, tempera, watercolor, and he not only painted realistic landscapes, the detail is amazing, but the feeling created by these paintings, by these sort of portraits of a window, give you a feeling of isolation, silence, abandonment, but also expectation. The character in the painting seemed to dissolve, but you still feel a presence. This painting in particular catches a moment when an ocean breeze flows through the window and gently lifts the curtain. It's as if you can feel the breeze. But he's deeply concerned with the visual complexities, by transparency, the symbolism of the window, and the geometric structure. And what I find really interesting about Andrew Wyeth that I didn't know for a long time is he believed that his work was greatly misunderstood. He repeatedly described himself as an abstract painter, saying that critics judged just the surface realism and they overlooked the underlying structure. He said himself, and I have to admit that this kind of describes me as a viewer, he said, you can have the technique and paint the object, but it's what's inside you, the way you translate the object, and that's pure emotion. I think most people get to my work through the back door. They're attracted by the realism and the sense the emotion and the abstraction, and eventually, I hope, they get their own powerful emotion. So as you can see, a window in and of itself can create this really complex landscape, portrait, abstraction, sky's the limit. And then finally, here I have a perfectly appropriate invitation. You can go full surrealist if you want and blow the theme out of the water. Here we have a Magritte painting who took art as a complete adventure into an undiscovered world, and it brings it full circle, sort of going opposite of what Alberti was outlining for the Renaissance art movement. Instead of showing that a painting can look like a window to a realistic world, he shows that even the window is false. His windows are dazzling and broken and lying on the floor, and so this imitation that you've been staring at, which was the window, now yields to the actual landscape, that the object itself is the only true perception. And the illusion created by the art makes us believe in the reality hidden behind the canvas, but really there's nothing, and that's the reality. So I would love to see anyone just smash it.
Right, we're recording.
So now it's time for you to start thinking about your subject. And as you begin, you're going to start putting some subjects in front of yourself. So walking around to your windows, looking at photos, whatever you have in mind. And you're going to start making observations. And as you do, these might be in line with your initial idea, or as you look at these things, it might challenge what you thought your subject was going to be. Instead of painting your mom from a picture you have, you might all of a sudden become fascinated by shadows that are cast by the window, the lighting and how it changes the colors that you're looking at. You might all of a sudden be interested in some fleeting element of the outdoors and crop in the architectural element of the window itself. So just be open to playing with a few sketches and trying out a few different approaches. You might surprise yourself. You might go in a direction you never thought you would. So let's go through some tips and tricks that will kind of help you as you go along. Looking at just a few of these paintings by Andrew Wyeth, I want you to think about challenging your perspective. So here we have 3 different window paintings, and the angle is completely different, the cropping is completely different, and we're getting a really different effect and impression from these images. So from your window of choice, particularly if you're working from life, even if you're working from a photo, you can kind of crop differently. But try sitting higher, sit lower, move in, move out, change your perspective, and try to look at it from a Wyethian, from a perspective that is angled in different ways, and see what stands out to you. Just move around your subject. As you start to draw, you're going to want to block in your big shapes first. So here we have just a simple drawing of a window scene with the frame in the scene. And as you block in your big shapes, maybe the first big shape you block in is the window itself. And you can kind of scale everything else around the largest objects that you draw. So a building might take on a box form, and a bush might take on a blob. You'd be amazed at how quickly you can arrange your shapes in a complicated scene just by loosely blocking in the big shapes. And that way everything is scaled with each other, and you don't run into a lot of perspective or issues. Another pointer is to work near to far. So in this example, we've got a Matisse painting that is bright and bold, and it's kind of smashed all the planes into each other. But as you can see, even with that sort of compression of planes, you still have an illusion of space. And it's because basically the images are placed in front of each other. There's overlapping. So the table and the tomatoes and the vase are painted first, and then the background, and then the picture on the wall, and then the wall and the floor, and then the door, and then the background. So even though there's not the common elements of illusion, it's still created by just starting near to far. So that's another thing that you can do in your drawing. Finally, I encourage you to save the details for last. So once you've got your big blocks in there and you've kind of drawn from near to far, if that appeals to you, this whole time you're avoiding the temptation to get pulled into the details. So keep thinking working big to small. You'll be surprised You might even go through some really good editing by doing this, leaving out the tiny stuff and figuring out what's big and important. So organize as you get smaller. So finally, it's time to create. Again, don't just go with your first sketch or your first idea. Play around with it a little bit. Do a couple of different versions on the theme, and whatever media you have on hand should suffice. Experiment with that too. Have fun. I cannot wait to see what you see.